Aizawa Podfics. Today we're going to be reading chapter 8, 9, and 10 of Your Presence to Dream in This Godforsaken Nightmare by Chaotic Bitch 033. Here's a summary. Izuku draws Overhaul's attention away from Aizawa. Izuku wasn't sure what he was doing. Really, he had no idea where this plan had come from. He blamed Aizawa's bad influence and Katsuki. Both had instilled him in a sense of bravery and rebelliousness that he didn't seem to have previously. Aizawa's presence and training had given him confidence, while Izuku's memories of Katsuki provided him with the inspiration. Inspiration for what? Well, the inspiration to make a scene, of course. If there was one thing Katsuki had taught Izuku, it was how to get all eyes on him, whether it be for better or for worse. And so, that was how Izuku found himself in his current predicament. When he had woken up to an empty cell, Izuku had panicked. He knew, logically, that Aizawa was being tortured, most likely by Overhaul. He couldn't just sit by and let that happen. He had to do something. If their attention was on him instead of Aizawa, it meant that he wouldn't get hurt as badly, hypothetically at least. So, Izuku made a scene. Firstly, he looked for a weapon, something sharp or blunt, anything he could hurt himself or someone else with. Everything in the room was bolted to the floor, so that left Izuku with very few options. The only items not bolted to the floor were the ratty blankets and pillows on the bed, the bar of soap on the sink, and the paper and crayons scattered around the floor. He could always draw Overhaul a nice little picture. The man would probably stop murdering his hero and play a fun game of tic-tac-toe with Izuku instead. Yeah, not likely. He needed something jagged, something that could actually hurt someone. But there was nothing in the room that he could even break to get that. The light bulb flickered above him, catching his attention. Izuku took a closer look at the metal cage surrounding it. He wouldn't be able to remove them, but they were thin and far enough apart that something could slip through. Something small and easy to throw, heavy enough to break the bulb, like a bar of soap, for example. Throwing the bar of soap hard enough and accurately enough to actually break the light bulb proved to be rather difficult, and after about a dozen failed attempts, Izuku finally succeeded. Broken glass rained down on the floor, fragments falling around him. He jumped out of the way to avoid them, picking through the pieces once everything had settled. By luck alone, and he was able to find a rather large shard with a sharp tip, sharp enough to do some actual damage. After sweeping the rest of the broken glass under the bed with one of the blankets, he really didn't want to step on them and not be able to walk. He moved on to the next step of his plan. Izuku grasped the sharp shard tightly in his hand, approaching the metal door of his cell with purpose. He took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what he was about to do next. Pulling back his right fist, he began vigorously banging his hand against the metal door, a resounding thud ringing out with every hit. As he did so, he screamed as loud as he could, voice echoing in the previously quiet cell. To say it was loud was an understatement. The banging on the door alone would have been enough to draw attention, but Izuku had some serious pipes. He wailed like a banshee, waiting for someone to come down to find the cause of the commotion. Within minutes, he could hear the rattling of the lock from the door in front of him, someone cursing on the other side of the metal. He quickly retreated to the far side of the room, still screaming, waiting for the door to swing open. It was guard number 3, who walked in next, the same one who had dragged Izuku up to Aizawa's first examination. His bald head shone with sweat, eyes wide and dangerous. He was pissed. "What the hell is going on here?" the man practically growled, a bulging vein pulsing on his neck. Izuku swallowed the fear that tightened his throat, struggling to keep his voice from shaking. "Bring the doctor down right now, or else." His wide green eyes met the dark brown of the guard, who proceeded to snort loudly across the room, crossing his muscular arms across his chest. "Or what, Pipsqueak? You gonna cry?" Instead of responding, Izuku raised a glass fragment up to his throat, its sharp end resting right against his skin. He was struck with a sudden sense of deja vu and resisted the urge to laugh. The guard's face fell, in previous amusement far gone. He started moving towards Izuku, stopping when the boy spoke, his free hand extended in warning. I wouldn't come any closer if I were you, unless you want to explain to your boss why his test subject bled out under your watch, Izuku said confidently, sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He was more grateful now than ever for Aizawa's lesson in manipulation and deceit. Glaring at Izuku, his mouth pressed together in a tight line, the guard hesitated. He stood still for a moment, as if trying to assess the validity of Izuku's threat. His eyes flitted between the glass and Izuku's face, hand twitching towards the taser strapped to his belt. Izuku pressed the shard into his throat harder, unflinching as beads of crimson dripped down his neck. The guard froze. Call your boss, Izuku snarled, or I'll slit my fucking throat. Choice is yours, but I suggest you choose quickly. His heart was pounding again against his chest, his blood almost buzzing in his veins. It had to work. It had to. Okay, just don't do anything stupid, the guard snapped, reaching carefully to the walkie-talkie on the other side of his belt, telegraphing his movements clearly. Pressing the device's largest button, he spoke in a low, gruff voice. Doc, I need you down in the cell ASAP. Patient 139B is threatening suicide. He managed to break the light bulb and is armed with a piece of glass. I repeat, I need you down in the cell ASAP. All while the guard sent his message, Izuku only returned his angry glare, trying to keep his hands from shaking. His stomach churned with a combination of fear and exhilaration, glad that his plan was working, but terrified of the fallout. The consequences of his actions, he only hoped that it would be enough to save Aizawa from Overhaul's quirk, even for a few minutes. The doctor didn't respond to the walkie-talkie. Instead, barely 2 minutes after the guard had messaged him, pounding footsteps could be heard racing to the cell's entrance. The doctor, disheveled and breathing hard, practically flew inside the room, stopping suddenly when he saw the position Izuku was in. Anger and annoyance could be seen on his face, followed by a fleeting look of fear, desperation. Izuku wasn't sure, although he would be lying if he said that seeing the doctor so frazzled wasn't exhilarating. The man tried to take a step forward, but backed up quickly when Izuku raised his hand further, still digging into his throat. The doctor held up his hands, his palms facing Izuku in a placating gesture. Really, Izuku had to stop ending up in these situations. Now, boy, we don't want to do anything rash. Why don't you put that down, He gave a tense smile, eyes fixated on the weapon at Izuku's neck. Izuku could see him swallow nervously, could see his hands trembling every few seconds. It gave him confidence, quelled some of the fear weighing in his chest. I'm not your boy, and I'll stop when Eraserhead is brought back, Izuku growled, trying to replicate the tone Katsuki always used when he was mad, the one that inspired panic to anyone on its receiving end. At this, the doctor paled. He lowered his hands slightly, feet shuffling forward. Now, doctor, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. The familiar words made the man's eyes widen in indignation. I said... Izuku's gaze met the doctor's, his resolve unwavering. Bring Eraserhead back. The doctor grit his teeth, his eyes falling once again to the glass shard piercing Izuku's neck. The cell was quiet as the man thought about what to do, trying to find a way out of the situation, but clearly finding none. After a moment's pause, he turned to guard number 3, his voice clipped and full of dread. Notify Overhaul. Bring Eraserhead down here. The guard nodded, making his way quickly out of the cell to complete his orders. Izuku could have collapsed in relief. Aizawa was going to be okay. He had to be okay. Then he thought about the implications of what he had just done. Overhaul was probably on his way down here, and he was not going to be happy. That much was sure. Izuku shuddered just thinking about the man. The last thing he wanted to see was was to see him again. There was something about the way he had looked at Izuku. It was unnerving, like he was a piece of treasure, something to be cherished. Similar to the way a child looks at a Christmas present, except far, far more disturbing. Caught in his musings, Izuku almost didn't notice the doctor creeping slowly towards him, his head shot up, eyes blazing as he pressed the shard of glass into his throat harder, the flow of blood down his neck that had previously slowed now picking back up. "I don't think Overhaul would like if I died. Wouldn't you agree, Doctor?" Izuku's voice was cold and calculating. He'd analyzed both Overhaul and the Doctor's quirks. He was 98% sure the Doctor couldn't revive people, and that Overhaul could undo damage he did, but not what others inflicted. Judging by the Doctor's alarm, he had a feeling he was correct. Honestly, Izuku wasn't sure how he was staying this calm. It seemed like his lessons with Aizawa were paying off. And so, the two stood silently, poised in a dangerous showdown until Overhaul arrived. It was the longest 15 minutes of Izuku's life. His arm shook with the strain of being held up for that long, so much so that he had to focus on not actually slitting his throat. The Doctor never took his eyes off of him, obviously worried that he would slip up. Izuku almost wondered why the Doctor was so panicked, but after watching his interaction with Overhaul, it made sense. If Izuku died on his watch, the Doctor would be ripped to shreds. It would not be pleasant, that much was certain. After waiting for what it felt like hours, it was around 20 minutes, a set of footsteps could be heard approaching the cell, the slow and meticulous gait accentuated by metallic shoes clicking on the stone floor. Izuku tightened his grip on the shard of glass, his heart rate spiking. The footsteps drew closer and closer until finally Overhaul's tall figure entered the cell, his expression unreadable. The man approached the pair, stopping next to the Doctor. His gaze swept Izuku up and down, and Izuku fought the urge to scream under the intense focus. "Well, you've certainly landed yourself in quite the predicament, huh, Izuku?" Overhaul drew out the syllables of the boy's name almost playfully, and it made Izuku shiver in disgust. It was the first time that the man had actually said his name, and Izuku hated how it sounded coming from his mouth. He grit his teeth, glaring at Overhaul, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response just yet. Overhaul's gaze stuck on Izuku for another moment before turning to the Doctor, his eyes blazing with fury. "And you?" At this, the Doctor stiffened. "I'm still not pleased about your previous misstep. Go fetch Eraserhead with the others and bring him down here. Do it quickly, and I'll consider lessening your punishment." Overhaul's voice was disinterested, detached, and cold, but his presence was dangerous. The Doctor nodded, swallowing thickly. "Yes, sir," he stuttered, before scampering out the side of the cell, rushing to distance himself from the terrifying figure that was Overhaul. It was almost funny. Almost. Now, it was just Overhaul and Izuku in the cell. The panic and fear Izuku had been ignoring previously reared its ugly head, and was burning a hole in Izuku's stomach with a steady hand. Overhaul unclasped the glove on his right hand, taking it off, and he took a step forward. It took every ounce of restraint Izuku possessed to not take a step back. Instead, he tightened his grip on the shard of glass at his throat, eyes widening in warning. I wouldn't do that." Izuku inwardly cringed at the break in his voice. He couldn't help his trembling now. Overhaul only tilted his head slightly, almost curiously, at the gesture. He took another step forward. Under his foot, something cracked, sharp and loud, in the silence of the cell. Both he and Izuku froze. Slowly, Overhaul moved his boot to the side, revealing a broken crayon. The man leaned down to pick up the two halves, holding it carefully between his fingers. As Izuku watched, the crayon seemed to almost bubble, warping horribly before it exploded into pieces. Dust, really. He knew it was some type of terrible dissociation tactic, but Izuku couldn't help but flinch. Overhaul stepped forward again. This time, Izuku stepped back. His shoulder blades hit the stone wall behind him, chest heaving with panic as he tried to swallow the lump in his throat. He steeled himself, readjusting the shard of glass until it sat right on top of his jugular vein, waiting. Overhaul paused at the action, seeming to think. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. It wasn't warm, but it was quite quiet, considering. You really would, wouldn't you? Overhaul's darkened eyes bored into his soul, and Izuku's breath faltered at the question. He fought the tears that were threatening to spill down his cheeks, gritting his teeth. You were hurting him. Izuku's voice broke again. The confidence that had previously possessed him now gone. He was scared, terrified. He didn't know what else to do. He just had to do something. You were hurting Zawa. Tears streaming down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't look away, too scared that Overhaul would pounce in his moment of weakness. The room fell silent as Overhaul observed him, just watching. Slowly, with a care that Izuku didn't know what to do with, Overhaul knelt down in front of Izuku, eye to eye with the young boy. Izuku scrunched up his face in confusion, hand tightening around the weapon he was holding. Overhaul stared into his eyes for a moment, the air thick with tension, with fear. Izuku waited for Overhaul to do something, to hurt him, to get mad. Instead, he spoke. I wonder if you know the power you hold. And that wasn't what Izuku was expecting. He froze, his grip on the shard of glass loosening ever so slightly as he turned the words over in his head, trying to understand. Overhaul was still looking at him with those unreadable eyes, as if he was saying something Izuku couldn't. But I'm quirkless. The words slipped out before Izuku could stop himself. For all he knew, this was just an attempt to get him to drop his guard, for Overhaul to tear him apart. But he was scared and confused, and it didn't make any sense. The man's face twisted, his eyes narrowing, and his cheeks moving. With a start, Izuku realized that Overhaul was smiling under the mask. His eyes alight with excitement. The sight made Izuku's skin crawl. Exactly. Izuku didn't like any of this. He didn't like what Overhaul was saying, or how he was looking at him, or how close he was. The sound of footsteps echoed throughout the cell, approaching them quickly. Overhaul stood back up, his face returning to the cold, emotionless mask he usually wore, and the moment was broken. Guard number 3, accompanied by the doctor, entered the cell. In the guard's arms was an unconscious Aizawa, covered in white bandages that were spotted with red. Izuku had never seen the man look so small, so defenseless. It made his heart drop in his chest, his mouth falling open in a silent gasp. The guard made his way over to the bed carefully, paying close attention to Izuku as he dropped Aizawa unceremoniously onto the bottom bunk. Izuku fought the urge to rush to the hero's side, but he relaxed slightly, knowing that at least Aizawa wasn't being hurt right now. He tried not to think about what had happened before, what he had failed to prevent. Guilt ate away at his stomach as he shoved those thoughts away for another time. He wasn't out of the clear just yet. Overhaul returned his gaze to Izuku, and any remnants of his past fondness long gone. Consider yourself lucky, child. He sneered, the tone enough to make Izuku's blood run cold. With another glance at him, Overhaul began walking out of the room. Get this mess cleaned up, he called out to his subordinates as he disappeared around the corner. Only when Izuku couldn't hear the man's receding footsteps did he allow himself to breathe, his heartbeat slowing down considerably. The doctor fixed his gaze on Izuku, the previous panic that had occupied his features now gone. A tired and angry look in its place. Noting the shard of glass still at the boy's throat, the doctor sighed deeply, reaching into a pocket of his lab coat and retrieving a small, cylindrical object that Izuku didn't recognize. Looking now at the guard, the doctor nodded. Without a single word uttered between them, both figures turned around and walked right out of the cell, the metal door clanging shut behind them. Izuku stood there, in shock, looking around, bewildered. It took a few moments for Izuku to finally drop the shard of glass at his throat and rush to Aizawa's side. He sighed in relief as he felt a strong and steady pulse from the man's wrist. Kneeling on the ground next to the bed, ignoring the shards of glass embedding themselves in his skin, Izuku moved Aizawa into a more comfortable position, sliding the flimsy pillow underneath his head and covering the man with the other ratty blanket. The adrenaline was slowly leaving Izuku's system, and he was left shaking like a leaf, tears now streaming steadily down his face. He let his head fall against the mattress, shoulders trembling as he sobbed quietly. He was so exhausted, so absorbed in his relief that Aizawa was alive and breathing and safe, that he failed to notice the small object the doctor had been holding but being slid into the room through the small compartment in the bottom of the door, emitting an odorless and colorless gas. Izuku could feel his eyelids grow heavier. His attempts at staying vigilant becomes more difficult by the second. He was just so glad that Aizawa was here, was safe, and he was tired. So tired. His breathing evened out, body slumping against the mattress as he fell into a dreamless sleep. The room was quiet once more, almost peaceful. The sleeping gas dissipated quickly, and soon enough, two familiar figures stepped into the cell. The doctor's associates, the woman that had bathed and cleaned Izuku, regarded the room with silent consideration. Eraserhead was unconscious on the bottom bunk's mattress, and Izuku was collapsed against him, still kneeling on the ground, also unconscious. The floor was covered with shattered glass, haphazardly swept to the side by a discarded blanket. The two women worked in silence, sweeping up the glass, removing anything not bolted to the floor, leaving the mattresses and the blanket that wasn't covered in glass, and eventually lugging in a fresh mattress to position next to the bottom bunk. The previous mattress had shards of broken glass in its seams and needed to be removed. Carefully, the woman maneuvered Izuku into a sitting position, cleaning the wound on his neck and removing the tiny pieces of glass that had embedded themselves in the boy's knees. He has a chance, with the heroes, the younger of the two women muttered, looking at the boy carefully as she bandaged his neck. The older woman froze just for a moment before putting new sheets on the mattress, not responding. "Kure, we could do something this time." "Lower your voice," she finally replied, whispering at her partner angrily. "What do you want to do? Call the heroes? Take out Overhaul? I don't like any of this either, but I'm not naive enough to think that we could actually save this boy. You heard what they have planned for the man, which is exactly why we have to help. Just think about it, please. I can't bury another one of them, please." The two women looked at each other, silent, angry, scared, before turning their eyes downward. Kurai placed Izuku on the new mattress, his injuries freshly bandaged, her gaze catching on his sleeping face. He was so tiny, so young. No more words were spoken between them. They had said all that needed to be said, for now, at least. After the room was fully cleaned and the light bulb replaced, covered completely, this time with an unbreakable see-through shield, the two women left, with neither Izuku nor Aizawa any the wiser of their quiet visitors. Chapter 9. Don't Leave. Summary. Aizawa recovers from his time with Overhaul. When Aizawa had finally woken up after his meeting with Overhaul, Izuku broke down crying. He tried so hard not to. Aizawa needed support, not a sobbing child to take care of. But try as he might, he couldn't hold back his tears when dull, dark eyes met his worried gaze, like a pool of split ink. They were a seemingly endless chasm of pitch black, devoid of emotion, of life. Izuku pulled Aizawa into a loose hug, wary of his injuries. After he had helped him into a sitting position, he had never seen the man like this, had never seen anyone like this, breathing, but lifeless. Aizawa was a shell of a person. He wasn't responding to Izuku's questions or touches, seemingly unaware that Izuku was even present. As he cried, Izuku talked to Aizawa. The boy was no stranger to dissociation. He remembered in the months before Aizawa arrived, the state of emptiness that he'd slid into after every session with the doctor. The world would fade into the background, and everything would feel so far away. He'd be aware of everything that was going on around him, but couldn't seem to bring himself to break out of that fuzzy state of mind. He figured that was what Aizawa was going through right now, most likely. It was his brain's way of coping with what Overhaul had put him through. So Izuku cried. He cried, and he held his hero. He braided his hair and whispered to him about papiros and cats and his favorite segments on President Mike's radio show. He rambled on about anything his brain could latch onto. Unfortunately for Aizawa, who Izuku wasn't sure could even hear him, Izuku had a plethora of knowledge on microeconomics, mechanical engineering, and foreign policy. It made for some very dry filler. Honestly, Izuku was just scared of the silence. He was worried that if he were to stop talking, Aizawa would slip deeper into the darkness and never return. So Izuku talked, sniffling between sentences, sitting with Aizawa in the dimly lit room, trying not to completely lose his mind. It took almost 2 hours for Aizawa to break out of his state of disassociation, as Izuku was talking about vertical integration. He was seriously running out of things to talk about. He could feel Aizawa stir slightly beside him. Izuku stopped talking. He was still positioned next to Aizawa, having moved to share the bunk bed mattress with him, so he could support his weight and make sure he didn't strain his injuries. He moved to retract his arm from the man's shoulders, now that he seemed to be coming to, but a trembling hand stopped him in the process. Zawa? Are you... Can you hear me? Izuku's voice kept breaking, fear and worry evident in his tone. He studied Aizawa's face closely. His eyes held more life in them than before, although he didn't seem to be very aware of his surroundings. Kid. Aizawa's voice was barely a croak. It wasn't the usual gruff, stoic voice that Izuku had come to associate with the underground hero. That one word was full of vulnerability, spoken quietly and despondently, as if worried that Izuku was merely a figment of his imagination. It tore Izuku's heart to pieces to hear the man so utterly broken. I'm here, Zawa. Izuku stifled back a sob. I'm here. He pulled Aizawa closer, practically cradling the man in his arms as they both sat on the flimsy mattress, sorrow thick and heavy in the air. Izuku just held his hero as Aizawa's shoulders trembled. He didn't say anything when he felt teardrops land on his skin, soaking into the cloth of his shirt. He didn't say anything to discourage Aizawa's grip on his forearm. He a wavering hold that screamed, "Don't leave me." He didn't ask about what had happened, or if Aizawa was okay. Instead, he sat quietly, arms circled around Aizawa in a protective embrace as the man cried. Aizawa had always been Izuku's knight, his hero, but his armor had been stripped and his shield had been destroyed. He had seen war, and it had shattered him. He had nothing to protect him now, no shield to brandish and no horse to ride in battle. Izuku vowed to be his armor tonight. He promised to hold him, to protect him. He couldn't rebuild the fortress that Aizawa Shoda had so carefully constructed, but he could stand guard while the man picked up the pieces. It took a long time for Aizawa to return back to his normal state of self. Neither he nor Izuku spoke of that day while the man recovered, letting the topic rest until he was feeling better. After 2 weeks, it was finally brought up. "You did what?" Aizawa was using his teacher voice, sharp and cold. It demanded attention, respect. He'd never used it with Izuku before, but it came naturally after what Izuku had just told him. Aizawa had been wondering this entire time why Overhaul had left so suddenly when he had returned to the cell early. Izuku would always dodge his questions, but Aizawa didn't let him skip out on answering this time. The kid flinched at the accusing tone, seemingly already regretting telling Aizawa what happened. I woke up and you were gone, Sawa, and I knew that they had taken you, that it had to be Overhaul, and I was so scared. I didn't want them to hurt you because I knew what it feels like, and it worked. They stopped hurting you. Izuku's voice was shaking and his eyes were watery, but he met Aizawa's calculating gaze. His face set and fists clenched. Aizawa had seen the same look on the faces of his students more times than he could count, the look of a person whose reckless self-sacrifice had been praised in the past, had maybe even saved lives, but that kind of behavior got students and heroes alike killed. It was unacceptable. And Aizawa wouldn't allow Izuku to think that it was okay. "So you decided to draw the attention of a criminal mastermind to a literal murderer instead, by threatening to kill yourself. Is that it? Did I get that part right?" Aizawa's voice was still quiet, but pointed. He didn't need to yell to get his message across. That's not... Izuku scrunched up his face, his cheeks red and his eyes puffy, his mouth opening a few times but no words coming out. "I knew they wouldn't kill me. They need me. It was the only leverage I had, Sawa. I knew it was risky, but it was worth it. You're safe, and Overhaul left, and he didn't come back." Dark eyes peered up at Aizawa pleadingly, now spilling over with tears. Aizawa's glare softened ever so slightly, but he relented. "Izuku, he could have hurt you. Hell, he could have killed you. That man is unstable and incredibly quick to anger. Your life is important, kid. I appreciate you trying to look out for me, but this isn't the way to do it." Izuku seemed to only cry harder at this, his brows furrowed in frustration. It was a startling sight in all the times that Aizawa had known the boy. He'd never seen Izuku like this, almost angry. "But how else do I stop them from hurting you? Zawa, it worked. You're right, my life is important to them, which means they're not going to kill me, and so..." "I'm going to stop you right there." Aizawa clamped his mouth shut as Aizawa's interjection. The room felt falling quiet. Aizawa didn't want to snap at the kid, but he knew it was the only way to get through to him right now, and he had to get through to him. Under no circumstances will you ever try anything like that again. Got it?" Izuku opened his mouth to protest, but it was cut off once again. "No, you don't get to refuse, Izuku. You're still a child. I won't have you put yourself in harm's way for my sake. I'm a hero. This is my job. I'm not going to ask again. Do you understand?" A moment passed in silence before Izuku turned his eyes to the floor, his tears dripping onto the stone. "Yes, I understand. Izuku closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Kid, look, I'm not mad at you. At that, Izuku's head shot up. You're not? Sighing, Aizawa ran a hand through his hair, guilt pulling in his stomach. Maybe he had been too harsh. He just needed Izuku to be safe. That was all. He couldn't encourage his behavior, not when it could have gotten him killed. No, I'm upset, but I'm not mad at you. Listen, I don't want you hurting yourself or risking your life for me. It's dangerous. I don't want to lose you, kid. Aizawa's shoulders slumped, the exhaustion of the past few weeks finally catching up to him. Izuku looked at him for a moment, blinking, almost as if he were surprised. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I just wanted to help, he sniffled, scrubbing the tears from his cheeks with the back of his hand. I know, kid, you don't have to apologize. It's not your fault we're in this mess. Just be careful, okay? Aizawa didn't try to cover up the break in his voice, didn't try to hide the concern in his eyes. He wasn't sure he could right now anyways. Nodding, Izuku launched himself forward into his arms, snuggling his head into the crook of Aizawa's neck, his tiny, scarred hands wrapped around the man's shoulders, holding onto him tightly. Aizawa just chuckled, now used to Izuku's constant hugging. He patted the kid's head, returning his embrace warmly. Aizawa waited until Izuku pulled away, his cheeks flushed, looking like he wanted to apologize. Aizawa was trying to train that habit out of him, but staying silent. If the kid needed a hug, he was going to get a hug. That Aizawa was never going to accept an apology for. Now, come on. How about we train for a little? Really? Can we work on our roundhouse kicks today? I've been trying to get them down, but I can't seem to get my legs to work how they should. As Izuku rambled, his eyes alight with his hands waving around with every few words Izuku thought about before. Izuku had looked surprised when he had reprimanded him, surprised that he would care, as if Aizawa was the first in his life to do so. He wanted to ask who had taught him that he was so indispensable, but he knew better than to push even further than he already had, for today at least. It was infuriating that Izuku was so quick to put himself in danger, and even more terrifying that Izuku didn't understand why it was so wrong. Aizawa only hoped that with time, he could instill a sense of self-worth into the kid. Being in a prison cell wasn't helping, neither was the torture, or the lack of human contact, or the murderer hovering over their shoulders. The list went on. He shook his head to clear it, trying to refocus on Izuku, who was still talking. He had promised to train the kid, after all. And so, the pair trained. Izuku had since progressed from the basics and was now learning more offensive maneuvers. Honestly, Aizawa was impressed with how quickly he was able to pick up on things. When he first started instructing Izuku about a month and a half prior, Izuku could barely last 30 seconds before being knocked flat on his ass while sparring. Now, he could last a solid few minutes against Aizawa. He was no pro, but that was undeniable, but his skill wasn't to be underestimated. Since Overhaul had last visited, Izuku and Aizawa were left untouched by the doctor. The only sign that the facility hadn't been completely unabandoned was the food still being slid under the cell door twice a day during that stretch of time. It was odd, unsettling. Something was going to happen, and Aizawa wasn't sure what, but they didn't take the time for granted. He and Izuku used it to grow stronger, to train, and to plan. As it was, the plan was still in its beginning stages. There were simply so many unknowns. Aizawa figured that if he could get past the guards and avoid Overhaul, he would be in the clear. The doctor couldn't really do much in a fight. His quirk wasn't combat-based, and the man was pretty scrawny. The guards, however, proved more difficult. They were almost the size of All Might. packed with muscle and built like brick walls. If he had to fight them, quirk or no, Aizawa wasn't sure if he could win. That didn't even account for Overhaul, or the facility itself. Without a map, there was no way escaping was possible. Unless they could find a phone and call for backup, there wasn't much that could be done. That didn't stop Izuku and Aizawa from planning, though. Ideas to get more information were constantly sprung back and forth, as well as possible escape routes. Vents, windows, sewers, and so on. All they needed was to bide their time wisely and hope that they weren't killed before they could get out. It wasn't a pleasant thought, but it served to be a decent motivator. Aizawa glanced over idly at Izuku, the boy currently doing some stretches over their sparring session. His skin shone with a thin layer of sweat, his eyes sharp and concentrated. He had seen that look in the eyes of underground heroes and villains. It was a look that could see right through you, eyes that could tear apart in a single glance. It was never a look he had seen in the eyes of a child, until now, that is. Sensing somehow that he was being observed, Aizawa met Aizawa's stare and smiled. It was bright and genuine, and it knocked the breath from Aizawa's lungs. He could only manage a nod back at the kid. He returned to his stretching. Izuku had changed in the several months that Aizawa had come to know him. He was still small, but he had gained a little muscle from their training. He had also gained far too many scars from his visits with Overhaul and the doctor. His entire body was covered in them, pinkish white lines swirling around his pale skin, depicting an almost mosaic of agony. His dark green hair was past his shoulders at this point, and could be mistaken for black in the darkness. His old doe-like eyes were less wide and trusting, now narrowed and darkened in constant suspicion. Freckles still painted his face, but any remnant of baby fat was long gone, replaced with a gauntlet that spoke of malnourishment. Although both Izuku and Aizawa were being fed, it was far from enough to support anyone long term. Let alone a growing child. He was going to get the two of them out. He was a hero, for fuck's sake. While he was preparing Izuku to fight to defend himself, he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Not if everything went according to the plan. The plan that was still a work in progress. Regardless, he was still going to protect him. Aizawa swore to himself that he would, but it was taking longer than expected. And honestly, Aizawa was scared. The facility was big, uncharted territory. He didn't know how many enemies he'd have to face to break out. Didn't know how to get the quirk suppressant out of his body. Didn't know if he'd be able to contact backup or get any weapons or be overhauled, and he didn't know if he could save Izuku in time. Izuku used to have so much hope in his eyes, and now he was far from hopeless. But Aizawa could tell that the kid was getting tired. The light in his eyes only ever grew darker now, and his smiles came slower and less frequently. The boy's kindness never wavered, though. No, Aizawa knew that behind the newly constructed walls of defense the kid had been building was a warm and gentle soul, still yearning to be the hero that no one ever bothered to be for himself. He could only pray that Izuku would make it out of this with some shred of his spirit intact. Unfortunately for Aizawa Shoda, God seemed to have other plans in mind. Chapter 10. Touch of Pain. Summary. The experiments continue. Izuku and Aizawa are changed forever. Aizawa wasn't sure how many months had passed since his kidnapping. He was kidnapped sometime in June. Of that he was certain, but without any windows in the cell, he couldn't accurately know when the days began and when they ended. It felt like he had been there for years, even if it couldn't have been more than a matter of months. The days were easier now than they were when he had first been taken. The aching in his chest whenever he would think about his husband and cats had lessened slightly. It never went away, truly, and the fear and helplessness that had consumed him in the beginning was more manageable. Maybe he was adjusting to his surroundings, or maybe he was just becoming numb. It was hard to say for sure. Of course, that was when the experiments changed. After Izuku and Aizawa had fully recovered from their meetings with Overhaul, they had been mainly left alone by the doctor. There were a few examinations every now and then, but nothing majorly debilitating or scarring. The piece was concerning. It meant that they were working on something, preparing for, well, Aizawa didn't know what. Until today, that is. Normally, Aizawa and Izuku would wake up around the same time. Aizawa always woke up first. And around an hour later, 2 trays of food would be slid under the door for them to eat. This morning, however, no food came. Instead, the door opened fully, revealing the 3 bodyguards that seemed to always accompany the doctor. Aizawa and Izuku were in the middle of signing about a plan for future combat lessons when they stopped abruptly, surprised by the sudden entrance. Aizawa stood quickly from his place on the floor, positioning himself between Izuku and the guards. His body was tense, preparing to spring into action at any moment. Izuku reacted similarly, on his feet instantly in front of the bunk bed and lowered slightly into a fighting stance. No one moved. The guards didn't attack them or anything, they just waited, glaring at them impatiently. Aizawa knew that whatever they had planned was going to be bad. Really, really bad. He spared a glance at Izuku. The kid was ready to fight, ready to follow Aizawa in whatever he did, wherever he went. It didn't make Aizawa feel better, knowing that he couldn't put Izuku at risk like this. In a fight between him and all 3 guards, Aizawa wasn't sure he'd be able to win, let alone protect Izuku in the process. Sighing, Aizawa relaxed into a less threatening position, nodding at Izuku to do the same. The guards finally approached them, one grabbing Izuku and the other 2 grabbing Aizawa. As they were dragged away, Izuku's gaze met Aizawa's. In his eyes, the hero could see fear. He could also see determination. The kid nodded at Aizawa before turning his gaze back to the hallway they were being pulled down. Somewhat startlingly, Aizawa realized that Izuku had been trying to reassure him. The thought weighed heavily in his mind, and on his chest he was escorted roughly into the doctor's office. The office itself had changed since the last time Aizawa had been in it. Instead of just the 1 observation table, there were now 2. They sat in the room menacingly, a foot's length apart from one another. The feeling of unease in Aizawa's stomach only grew at the sight. This wasn't good. Inside the room, fiddling with some equipment, was the doctor, donned with his goggles and surgical mask. The man stood tall in the stark white room, an air of anticipation surrounding them. Turning around upon the group's entrance, he gestured at the tables, a smile twisting his features under his mask. Welcome. Please, take a seat. The doctor chuckled. Aizawa rolled his eyes at the man's sick humor as the 2 guards holding his arms dragged him toward one of the nettle tables. Izuku was taken to the table closest to the doctor, which Aizawa instantly disliked. But a look of obvious discomfort on Izuku's face, he didn't like it either. But Aizawa knew that fighting would make things exponentially worse, so he didn't struggle as a guard fastened the leather restraints around his limbs, tightened painfully to prevent any movement. Izuku was subjected to the same treatment, and the room was quiet for a moment, letting Aizawa sort through his thoughts. Being here with Izuku was incredibly nerve-wracking. They had never tortured them together in the same place before, always taking them one at a time previously. He was trying to understand why that was. It didn't make any sense. Why were they together? Was this some type of psychological torture? Some way to break them mentally? Maybe it was another experiment, but on what? Was Overhaul going to make an appearance? Aizawa pulled it out of his musings as the doctor stepped closer to him, a scalpel in his hand. He tried to move to avoid such closeness, but no matter how hard he struggled, the bindings wouldn't give. Without any warning or preparation, the doctor pulled the collar of Aizawa's shirt down, pressing the scalpel against the skin where his neck and collarbone met. A sharp sting accompanying the action. Aizawa clenched his teeth, stifling a hiss. Usually, the doctor talked much more before actually experimenting on them. What the fuck was going on? There was no evil villain monologue, no sadistic jokes or anything. His confusion only grew when the doctor, still eerily silent, pried the incision open with his hands. Taken by surprise, Aizawa let out a gasp of pain, squeezing his eyes shut as a sensation of fingers ringing around in his shoulders. Izuku startled beside him at the sound. "Zawa, are you okay?" The doctor laughed, his fingers now poking around the inside of his shoulder, as if he were looking for something. Aizawa took a breath, trying to not let it show how much it actually hurt. It hurt like a bitch. "I'm fine, kid, just..." Aizawa had to grit his teeth from crying out again as the doctor probed deeper into his neck. He strained his body against the bindings, his brain screaming at him to get away. He could feel the doctor's fingers close around something embedded in his shoulders, and, ignoring the burning at the movement, finally realized why the doctor was digging into his neck in the first place. The quirk suppressor, the one they had implanted when Aizawa had been kidnapped. He was taking it out. Aizawa's eyes widened, his mind racing a mile a minute. He swallowed the bile forcing its way up his throat, trying to stay calm. With a sickening noise, the doctor finally managed to pull the quirk-suppressing device from Aizawa's shoulders. It was a small metal lump, coated in blood and entirely unassuming. But the removal had Aizawa's world turning upside down. All at once, he could feel his quirk returning to him, washing over his senses like a tidal wave. He gasped, too overwhelmed to even try and stifle the noise. It was like he was whole again. This entire time, he had felt so unbearably empty. He could always feel his quirk in his body, but it was faded, unreachable. Every time he tried to call upon it, he'd be stopped, and it was maddening. After months without it, he had grown accustomed to not being able to use it. But now, Aizawa could feel the power of his quirk coursing through his bloodstream, eraser alive at a single thought. Reflexively, he activated his quirk. He almost wept at the sensation, his eyes burning and his hair floating around his face. He was so consumed with the feeling that he didn't hear the doctor's satisfied hum, or Izuku's worried, "Zawa!" Only after a solid minute of Aizawa having eraser activated, when the sting of his eyes finally forced him to blink, did he deactivate his quirk and tune back into his surroundings. The elation at having his quirk back was replaced with cold, gut-wrenching fear. Because why else would the doctor give him his quirk back if not to experiment with? Almost as if reading his mind, the all-too-silent doctor spoke up. "I'm sure you're both wondering why you're here, and why I gave dear Eraserhead his quirk back. You see, Overhaul found something very interesting when collecting data on young Izuku. Something we're finally ready to explore on this very day." At the mention of Overhaul, both Aizawa and Izuku stiffened. The doctor continued, now pacing the length of the floor, footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet room. "Well, while Izuku is quirkless and therefore does not have a quirk factor, Overhaul detected an interesting presence in the boy's brain. Determining one's quirklessness can be done through observing the lack of an extra toe joint. Yes, but deeper examinations presented a mind difference in the brain of a quirkless individual versus that of a quirked. Located in the cerebellum, which is a cluster of neural pathways that are otherwise absent in the brain of a quirked individual, and in Izuku. This cluster just so happened to be incredibly resilient, stronger than any I've seen before. He paused, speeding up in his tangent, becoming more audibly excited with every word. After digging further, this group serves no apparent purpose. However, we believe them to be a sort of, possible quirk transmitter. One that, if presented with a quirk base, could bind to said factor and act as a bridge between the body and the quirk. Similarly to how a quirked individual's brain is already wired to do so. The doctor stopped his rant as well as his pacing, choosing instead to walk over to Izuku, reaching the edge of Izuku's middle observation table. He leant over the side, peering down at Izuku with glistening eyes, behind his shining goggles. Izuku could only stare upwards at the man, his eyes wide in fear and anticipation as he waited for the doctor to continue. Simply put, my boy. The doctor leaned even closer, barely a few inches away from Izuku's face. The child would have flinched away if possible. You have the possibility of gaining a quirk. For a horrifying moment, the room was quiet. Aizawa couldn't understand. His body was still adjusting to his quirk, and he was a smart man, but science, especially quirk science, was never his strong suit. But Aizawa had studied quirks for years, and everything clicked. No, you can't. Izuku was frantic, crying, and Aizawa still was trying to make it make sense, but he didn't know what was going on. What the hell do you mean by that? He raised his voice, struggling against his bindings fruitlessly. He didn't like how scared Izuku sounded, terrified in a way he'd never been before. The doctor just laughed, short and mirthless. Ha! That had Aizawa almost jumping out of his skin. I guess you'll find out, won't you? While the two captives wouldn't see the doctor's ruthless grin, they could hear it in his voice, could hear the satisfaction, the sadistic pleasure he took in their suffering, practically easing out of his tone. Izuku went to warn Aizawa, his voice shaking almost violently. Zawa, he's going to... Now, my boy, why don't you keep quiet, yes? I don't want you spoiling the surprise for our dear hero. Otherwise, it can make this process more painful than it needs to be, if you'd so prefer. The doctor's threat had Izuku snapping his mouth shut, falling silent once more. Aizawa racked his brain frantically, trying to think about what could possibly be happening. In his rant, the doctor was talking about neural pathways. Something quirks? That Izuku was special, but what did that have to do with him? Honestly, he hadn't been paying much attention to the doctor's ramblings, too focused on the fact that his quirk was back. His quirk was back. He knew that whatever was going to happen next wasn't good, a fact only reinforced by the fear in Izuku's voice. The doctor, now with something in his hands, approached the tables. Aizawa squeezed his eyes shut, fearing the worst. He expected the pain of a scalpel again, the dragging of a blade against his skin. It wouldn't be pleasant, but he would get through it. He had to. But the doctor wasn't working on him. Izuku let out a strangled cry of pain on his left. It was almost more like a scream, starting as a hoarse yelp and turning into a full-throated wail, filled with an agony that made Aizawa's instincts flail to go. Help. Save. His eyes were wide open now, desperately searching his field of vision, but only able to see the horrible white ceiling, and, out of the corner of his eye, the doctor's back, obscuring his view of Izuku. Even though he couldn't see him, he could hear him. His kid was screaming, crying, begging. Panic filled every part of his body, and he thrashed against the restraint because Izuku was being hurt. The doctor was hurting his kid. Izuku, you get your goddamn hands off him, you motherfucking bastard, or I'll... Aizawa's cries of rage were cut off by a spine-chilling squelching sound, another scream, and... The doctor moved his hands just a bit, holding something that Aizawa couldn't identify. He wasn't sure he wanted to in the first place. But the screaming had stopped. The room was filled instead with the sounds of Izuku's choked sobs, his heaving breath for air. Aizawa was absolutely livid. He was still struggling against the leather straps tying him to the table, growling with increasing aggravation as he made little to no progress. Without realizing, he had activated his core again, tears streaming down his face, but he couldn't feel the sting. He was too consumed by his fear, by his rage. Without even turning around, the doctor sighed, a pleased-sounding noise that only served to fuel Aizawa's fury. Now, Eraser, I ask that you calm down. Otherwise, your commotion may cause me to slip and hurt the boy even more. We don't want that, now do we? Gritting his teeth to try and steady himself, Aizawa swore he could see red, not because of his quirk. Kid, Izuku, can you hear me? I'm right here, okay? I know you're hurting, but we're going to make it through this. I work better in silence, Eraserhead. Be a dear and stop blabbering. Before Aizawa could bite back with a retort, Izuku spoke up. His voice was hoarse and broken, barely above a whisper. The kid was sniffling, still biting back sobs. I'm fine, Aizawa. And that absolutely tore Aizawa apart, to hear his kid mimic the words he himself had spoken just minutes ago. Trying to conceal such horrible pain was worse than any physical wound Aizawa could ever sustain. I believe, I said. The doctor spoke from his position at Izuku's side. Out of Aizawa's line of sight, Aizawa could hear something metal clang. Likely a tool being wielded by the doctor, before Izuku cried out in pain once more. I work better in silence. The room fell into a tense and anxiety-filled quiet, broken every few seconds by Izuku's muffled whimpers. Aizawa could barely breathe, his chest too tight, his heart pounding. He had no idea what was happening to his kid or how to help. All he knew was that Izuku was being hurt, and that the only thing stopping him from beating the doctors senseless were the leather bands tying him down. Walking over to the side of the room, farthest away from Aizawa, the doctor carried with him a medical bowl, placing it carefully on the cluttered countertop. He studied the bowl's contents for a moment before picking up a new set of tools. After what seemed like hours, but was really only a matter of minutes, the man returned to Aizawa's side, brandishing a familiar scalpel and metal bowl. And he repeated the process. Izuku writhed in his restraints, drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctor stood above him, scalpel in hand, lifting up Izuku's eyelid with his fingers as he... It was bright, white, stark, cold. Cut the connective tissue, the muscle, the nerve surrounding the fragile organ, digging his fingers into the socket and pulling, screaming. Who was that screaming? He yanked it out, and he yanked it out. He yanked Izuku's eye, and it was in his hands. He could see it with the one he had left. Izuku could see nerves dangling, still connected, and the doctor was grinning. He was laughing, and Izuku retched against the table, and the doctor reached back in to scrape something against the socket, and he was thrashing, screaming, sobbing, because it hurt. Izuku snapped awake, his mouth open in a silent scream, heaving frantically for breath. His whole body was shaking, hit with an ache that he didn't know what to do with. Everything felt charged somehow, as if his blood was made of static. Tears poured down his face, eyes stinging as he blinked at the harsh light beaming down. Trying to remember where he was and what was happening, he blinked again and again. The world around him seemed to slow down. If just for a moment, Izuku was blinking normally, or semi-normally. His left eye, the one the doctor had taken, was not normal at all. It felt weird, out of place, pulsing insistently with the beat of his heart. He didn't feel the emptiness he had felt previously, didn't feel the gaping spot of his eye socket exposed to open air. He could see out of both eyes. He reached up to touch it, wanting to see if it was real, if maybe everything was just a horrible nightmare, but couldn't move his arm. He was still in the doctor's office, still strapped in the observation table, but the doctor was gone, and the room was silent, aside from the sounds of his own breathing. Sawa, are you here? Izuku's voice broke painfully, his throat raw from his screaming. No response. Panic pressed heavily on Izuku's chest, clawing away at his insides. He tried to think back, tried to remember what happened, what the doctor had done. The last thing he could remember was the doctor taking his eye, his left eye, which was back now for some reason. He remembered Aizawa calling out to him, asking if he was okay, and then Izuku wasn't sure. He didn't know. It was harder to breathe now. Thoughts of an injured, or worse, his brain whispered, Aizawa racing through his head. He struggled against his restraints, feeling for any sort of leeway, but finding none. Eventually, abandoning his efforts, Izuku relaxed slightly against the table, inhaling and exhaling deeply like Aizawa had taught him. In for 5 seconds, hold for 6, out for 7. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. Izuku's biggest asset was his brain. It was time to use it. Quiet muttering filled the otherwise silent room as Izuku pieced together the day's events. He started with the things that he knew. He knew that he and Aizawa had been taken to the doctor's office together. He knew that Aizawa's quirk suppressor had been removed, and that the doctor had talked about Izuku's possibilities of gaining a quirk, something about neural pathways in the cerebellum. He knew that the doctor had Izuku squeeze his eyes shut, his mumblings coming to an abrupt halt. He could feel the pain, the consuming sensation of pure, bone-chilling hysteria that took over his body at the sickening intrusion of the doctor's hand in his eye. Izuku gritted his teeth together, trying to focus. Now wasn't the time to panic. He steadied his breath again before continuing. He knew that the doctor had removed his left eye. Izuku fought against the bile raising in his throat, pushing away the wave of intrusive thoughts. He knew that, for whatever reason, he had 2 eyes at the moment. He knew that he was in the doctor's office now, presumably having blacked out previously. He knew that he was alone. The thought brought tears to his eyes, which he quickly blinked away, onto the things he didn't know. He didn't know where Aizawa or the doctor were located. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, or why he was still in the doctor's office, still strapped down. He didn't know how he got his eye back. A voice in his head whispered that he did know. That he never got his eye back, that it was a question of who and not how. But he pushed those thoughts down a stairwell in his brain and locked the door to keep them out. He didn't think he could handle that right now. He couldn't handle any of this right now. In the first few months of Izuku's capture, when he was terrified and utterly alone, he spent hours at a time revisiting old memories, trying to gain his resemblance of warmth coming from embers of his past. Sometimes it helped, and sometimes it didn't, but it was the only thing he could think of trying to get his mind off of. Well, all of it. So he retreated to the safer places of his mind, away from the metal table he was strapped to, away from the cold, harsh light of the doctor's office. He forced himself to think about happier times, before he had been kidnapped, before he had been diagnosed as quirkless. He thought of his mother when he was little. She was always so warm. She'd play heroes with him, and always was the villain, so that Izuku could be All Might. They'd run around the house laughing, Izuku tripping over his own feet as he tried to catch up to her, cheeks hurting from smiling so hard. When he managed to reach her and demand that she go to jail peacefully, she'd do her best scary voice that had Izuku biting back giggles, trying to act serious and hero-like. He remembered when, anytime he got sick, she would make katsudon, and they would watch old hero movies on the couch together. Pajamas donned and stuffed animals clutched tightly to their chests. Or her exquisitive eyes whenever he would talk about her concepts few children were familiar with. The look on her face when he asked for a book about biochemical engineering for his birthday was priceless, and her hugs. She would envelop his whole body in her arms and rock him back and forth, humming softly to a tune only she knew. He didn't think of the blank look in her eyes that grew ever darker at his diagnosis. How as he grew older, she seemed to always be gone, working to pay for the house, for him. She would say, but the water was cold and the lights would shut off every few weeks, and he had to sell his hero merchandise to buy groceries when she didn't come home for days. No, he didn't think about that. Couldn't think about that. He thought of Katsuki, Kachan, his mischievous smile, his scarlet eyes. The boy was always covered in dirt or mud, unable to stay clean whenever they played outside. Whenever he'd see something cool or funny, his head would whip around, looking for Izuku, because, look, it's a fuzzy caterpillar. They'd spend the day together, playing and reading and exploring. And at night, they would stay awake under a carefully constructed pillow fort, talking about what kind of heroes they would be, what kind of costumes they would wear. Obviously, one colored blue, yellow, and red, just like All Might. They'd be strong, fast, kind, and together. They would do it together. They pinky promised, after all. He didn't think about the crackling of his palms, the look in his eyes when Bakugo found out that he was quirkless, when he realized it wasn't a joke. Izuku had never smelled burning skin before. He had never even considered the type of marks that a quirk like Bakugo's would ever leave on human flesh. Bakugo was passionate and relentless, qualities of a great hero. And in his world, Izuku was the villain, because why else would he have told Izuku to take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in his next life? Izuku was ripped out of his memories by the sound of a door closing, the heavy metallic click echoing throughout the room. He hadn't realized he was crying until now. Footsteps could be heard approaching the table. Izuku was strapped to, and the doctor's figure appeared in Izuku's peripheral vision. Ah, you're awake. Good, good. It looks like the eye has taken to you nicely. Even the tear ducts are working. It's quite tricky to revert such tiny nerves back to a previous state, especially when trying to connect them with a foreign eye. But everything has gone precisely as planned. Rifling through his jacket pockets, the man pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on and shining it directly into Izuku's left eye. Izuku blinked at the sudden light, flinching at the doctor's uncomfortable closeness. After a second, the man clicked the light off, with a satisfied hum. He pulled up a chair next to the table Izuku was on. Izuku's whole body tensed up, fear coursing through his veins like ice. Taking note of his terror, the doctor chuckled. Now, I'm not going to hurt you. No, these tests will be much less intrusive. Tell me, how does your eye feel? Izuku didn't respond. He just glared up at the ceiling, scared and angry in pain. He wanted to be with Aizawa. He didn't care about the doctor and his stupid test. Didn't even care if the man hurt him for staying silent. He wished the man would shut up and leave. As if sensing Izuku's rising indignation, the doctor shifted tactics. I'm sure you're wondering where your hero is. After hearing those few words, Izuku's fear shriveled up and died, replaced with a fury that had him seeing red. What did you do with Aizawa? Izuku growled, his voice full of hatred. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. The doctor covered his surprise by shifting in the chair, clearing his throat quickly. Don't worry, my boy, the man is alive. Actually, he He should be arriving any minute now, along with company. The doctor grinned at that, amusement evident in his tone. It only made Izuku more resentful. He opened his mouth to spit out an insult when the door opened once again. Izuku couldn't see who walked in, but if he could, all of the blood would have drained from his face. In walked guard number 1, carrying a limp Aizawa in his arms, flanked by none other than Chisaki Kai. Izuku heard the doctor rise from his seat, the squeaking of his chair echoing in the quiet room. "Welcome, welcome. Please set him down here." His eyes widened. Izuku's heart rate picked up. "Aizawa! Aizawa, is that you? Are you okay?" He pulled fruitlessly against his bindings, his cracking voice frantic as he called out for the man. No response. "I swear if you hurt him, I'll make you wish you were never born, you bastard!" Izuku's outburst was cut off by a cold, eerie voice. A voice he was all too familiar with. "What a filthy mouth you have. It seems the hero has corrupted you already. Shame." Izuku snapped his jaw shut so hard his teeth clanked together. A horrible blanket of cold, mind-numbing fear washed over him. It had been weeks, maybe even months, but Overhaul's voice was able to inspire terror in him as if he had just been ripped apart yesterday. He heard him click his tongue, humming approvingly. The sound made Izuku sick. And yet, like a dog, he can be trained. Good. Normally, Izuku would have been outraged by a comment like that, but all he could think about was what was going to happen next. Why they had Overhaul here of all places with Aizawa. Why they had experimented with their eyes. Why they had removed Aizawa's quirk suppressor. Dread seemed to tear apart his insides, bile stinging the back of his throat. He just wanted to disappear. Yet some higher power seemed to love torturing Izuku, and so he regretfully remained right where he was. He could hear movement throughout the room, metallic clanging noises and the shuffling of bodies, but he couldn't actually see anything other than the ceiling. That was until the doctor pressed a pedal with his foot, causing the operating table that Izuku was immobile against to move. He didn't even know it could do that. Within seconds, he was maneuvered into an upright position, finally able to see what was happening in the room. But the sights before him had Izuku wishing he could return to staring at the ceiling. Across the room from him, strapped to an identical metal table, was Aizawa. Normally, Izuku would be relieved at being able to see him, but his fear only worsens at the man's appearance. He looked horrible. His pale skin shone in the harsh light, speckled with blood. Long, greasy hair framed his face, limp and tangled. Even unconscious, his brows were furrowed, his lips pulled taut. Deep bags lined his eyes. The entire left side of Aizawa's face was covered in blood-stained bandages. Only his right eye was visible, seemingly untouched. Izuku wanted so badly to leap forward, to run and help him, hold him, to do something, but his hands were tied. Literally. Standing next to Aizawa was Overhaul himself, in all his Muppet glory. Still in the same green jacket and birdbeak mask, the man painted an intimidating figure. Izuku refused to meet his gaze, focusing instead on seeing if Aizawa had any other visible injuries. None that Izuku could see, which was good, but worrying in its own right. After finishing up the adjustments to Izuku's chair, the doctor cleared his throat, ignoring the glare that Izuku sent his way. "Now, my boy, I'm sure you've put 2 and 2 together by now. Today, we're going to be testing if the experiment was a success. I want you to activate Erasure." Izuku's heart seemed to stop. The world around him blurred. fading in and out of his vision as he processed what the doctor had said. He knew that this was coming. He had avoided it and pretended that it was something different, but he knew. It just didn't make the reality any easier to accept, to actually hear from another person. It didn't make it any easier to bear the fact that Aizawa's eyes was in his skull, and apparently part of his quirk. Izuku choked out a sob. He didn't want any of this. He never wanted any of this. Distantly, the doctor sighed. I guess we'll have to do this the hard way then. You're familiar with Mr. Overhaul's quirk, of course. The question was cruel and pointed, meant to scare Izuku into submission. Izuku was ashamed to say that it was working. He looked up at Overhaul's silent form, flinching as his golden eyes met his. He looked away quickly, wanting this to be over. Look, I don't know how, okay? I can't feel a quirk or anything, and I don't have any experience with this, so I can't just use it that easily. Izuku's voice was shaking and cracking with every word. The static in his skin was back again, prickling uncomfortably, insistently. Overhaul narrowed his gaze, the room falling silent. Izuku watched with widening eyes as the man reached to unclasp his glove, tilting his hand in Aizawa's direction. Wait, stop! I need time or something, or we could wait for him to wake up to tell me how to use it, Izuku pleaded, desperately trying to get Overhaul to step away from Aizawa. He searched frantically inside of himself for any sign of a quirk, but he couldn't feel anything. He couldn't do anything. It didn't help that he was panicking, his heart pounding against his chest and his breathing too fast, far too fast. One by one, Overhaul pulled his fingers out of his glove, not breaking eye contact with Izuku. Crying at this point, heaving for air, Izuku's voice rose. Please, just don't hurt him. I can't. If you don't want him getting hurt, my boy, then activate the quirk. It's really that simple. Doctor's tone was monotonous, cruel. The panic rising in Izuku's chest was suffocating. I'm trying. It won't work. Please, I'm trying. Overhaul's glove was off now, his hand reaching towards Aizawa. Stop it. Get away from... Stop! Izuku thrashed against the leather bindings, crying out in vain, just wanting everything to go away. Go away. Go away. Go away. Go away. Something inside Izuku snapped. The static feeling in his body overwhelmed him, flooding his senses and setting his nerves ablaze. Warmth surged through his entire being, filled him with a sense of strength, of power. He glared at Overhaul, who had his fingertips resting on Aizawa's forehead, and screamed, Go away. Overhaul snatched his hand away from Aizawa as if he had been burned, turning to stare at Izuku with eyes widened in shock, because Izuku had erased his quirk. His eyes had turned a flaming crimson, locks of hair floating around his eyes as if gravity could not touch it. Izuku's teeth were clenched in anger, snarling at Overhaul. For just a moment, he swore that he saw a trace of fear in the man's eyes, but just as soon as it appeared, it was gone. Overhaul turned to the doctor, his face blank. Prepare the training facilities for today. Run the other tests and get him cleaned up. I'll be back tomorrow to experiment further. The doctor barely had time to nod before Overhaul was out the door, glove already back on his hands, without a second glance in Izuku's direction. With the threat gone, Izuku blinked, and Erasure was no longer active. His eyes stung horribly, like he had just been crying for hours, and his head was pounding with a vengeance. But the pure fear and desperation had quieted down from Overhaul's departure. Izuku let himself sag against his bindings. For now, Aizawa was safe. Slipping into a brief state of unconsciousness, Izuku missed when the doctor had a guard bring Aizawa back to the cell. He missed the subtle twitch of Aizawa's hand when he passed by the doctor's equipment table. He missed when one of the doctor's scalpels disappearing underneath Aizawa's sleeves, completely unnoticed. With the grace and tact only an underground hero could possess. No, Izuku didn't see any of that, and neither did the doctor. Alright, everyone, that's the end of chapter 10. This is really depressing and super sad. By the way, when Izuku said go away, it had a ton of glitch effects around it, and it was like, I would be scared too, honestly. Overhaul was right to be scared. But, anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I'm sorry for all the stuttering. What time is it? It's 1 freaking a.m. Again, yes, I tend to record these this late. Speaking of late, I'm sorry this was so late. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed and have a fantastic day. And yes, that's all for life. What I was drinking in the middle of that was water, not coffee, so I'm sorry. So, you win. You guys freaking win. Anyways, thank you so much for watching and have a fantastic day. Cheese.